Hello, my fellow humans, and welcome back to another episode of the Sapien Score. And although it may be 3 years late, today we're going to be diving into Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, the 2019 game by From Software. This is the same studio responsible for pioneering the Souls-like genre, including Demon Souls, the Dark Souls trilogy, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. And for any gamers out there who've been living under a rock and have not heard of any of these games before, essentially they are extremely difficult action RPGs, heavy on the melee combat, and very boss-centric. And while Sekiro definitely shares its DNA with its Soulsborne predecessors, overall, it is probably the biggest departure from the series to date, with the inclusion of a much more fast-paced and parry-focused combat system, as well as fewer RPG elements, with the most obvious change being in the setting. The storyline of Sekiro taking place in a fictionalized feudal Japan, as opposed to the dark medieval fantasy of the Souls series and the dark gothic Victorian era of Bloodborne. The gameplay and storyline revolves around the player character, the shinobi Wolf, as he traverses through the lands of Ashina and fights a multitude of different enemy types and bosses along the way, all in attempts to protect and save his feudal lord. In the previous Soulsborne entries, RPG elements such as leveling up and customization options in terms of weapons and skill sets were very much a core identity to the gameplay. Sekiro definitely pairs back on these sorts of RPG elements in favor of a more straightforward and linear gameplay experience. The almost overwhelming amount of different weapon and armor types from the Soulsborne games is exchanged in favor of simplicity in Sekiro, with the only weapon that the character is equipped with being the sword that you're given at the very beginning of the game. The only supplementary combat weapon being in the form of the shinobi prosthetic, which has a number of different attachments known as the shinobi tools that can be unlocked by progressing throughout the campaign. Furthermore, the souls and blood echoes of the previous games, which were instrumental in leveling up your character's stats, have gone by the wayside in favor of the skill point system, which is much more forgiving in the fact that you do not lose your skill points if you die. Instead of being used to level up particular attributes and stats, the skill points are, you guessed it, used to unlock different skills and abilities that your character can use throughout traversing the areas as well as during combat. Speaking of combat, by far and away, the best aspect of this game is the combat system. At first, it's really difficult and weird, especially coming from the Dark Souls series, but after, I don't know, maybe a couple hours or so, things just begin to click, and it is just so immensely satisfying once you get it down. Unlike the other FromSoft games, the combat in Sekiro really awards aggression, and honestly it forces you to play aggressive because of the posture meter, which is kind of the new gimmick behind the whole combat system. Essentially, the bosses no longer have a fixed health bar, but have usually 2 or 3 lives, I guess, so to speak. And to take away one of those lives, you have to break their posture, which is done by just repeatedly attacking and also deflecting at the same time. So unlike Dark Souls and Bloodborne, there's not a lot of dodge rolling, but you're just constantly attacking and parrying. It's very parry-centric instead. When you finally fill up the posture meter and break the enemy's posture, they'll be stunned for a second, and this opens up a finishing move in which you either end the enemy completely if it's just one of the mob enemies, or take away one of their lives if it's the boss enemies. As I mentioned before, the only weapon that you have in the entire game is the sword that you start with, and the additional shinobi prosthetic tools, which aren't really used as primary weapons, but are used as just kind of supplementary tools that can stun different types of enemies, and they're much more situational. Honestly, I felt like the shinobi prosthetic was a little bit underutilized when I was playing. I don't know. A lot of times I felt like I just forgot about it and didn't find it crucial, because the sword is just really the bread and butter of the entire game, and breaking the enemy's posture, as well as deflecting and parrying, which also builds up the posture meter as well. And although I found the shinobi prosthetic a little bit lackluster in the midst of combat, it didn't really matter, because the combat is just so satisfying. It's kind of weird to say, but Sekiro honestly turns into a rhythm game once you get to a certain level and get over the initial learning curve of the combat system. And once you dial in and start feeling it, man, it feels so good when you just string together a chain of parries and then just follow it up with attacks on a boss. It just is so smooth and seamless once you get the hang of it, and just, as I mentioned before, extremely satisfying. On top of the actual combat mechanics, the game itself is just really well done in terms of the enemy diversity, and especially the boss diversity. Because let's be honest, that's what we all came here for, and that's what FromSoft is known for doing best, is the boss battles. And Sekiro does not disappoint at all. Hats off to the FromSoft team, because they did a fantastic job with these boss battles, and it really is a completely different experience to Dark Souls and Bloodborne, their past games. And while there's definitely some of that DNA still left in there, obviously the rage-inducing difficulty and extremely punishing movesets, I think they did a really solid job of putting Sekiro into kind of a category of its own with how you have to approach the boss battles, since you have to really be much more aggressive and constantly looking for those opportunities to strike as well as parry to build up that posture meter, because you can't just whittle away at the health bar. You have to be aggressive, and you have to be consistent and really on the money in order to build up that posture meter, because it will run out over time, and if you're not constantly attacking and parrying, you're screwed. Moving on from the well-deserved praise for the combat system, if you couldn't tell, I'm a pretty big fan. The setting is also extremely well done. I have to say, I'm a bit of a sucker for this type of feudal Japan, samurai, ninja aesthetic, so I might be a bit biased, but the overall level design and the different biomes and everything, there was just a ton of attention to detail, as well as just a ton of diversity in terms of the environments as well. The fact that I would go around exploring every nook and cranny and digging into every corner and hidden path is a real testament to the level design, as it never felt tedious or boring to explore around the map. Everything was just really well designed. The graphics were really well done, and it was just rewarding to explore around and find all the little hidden secrets, whether it be lore related or item related. And everything just came together really nicely to provide a real immersive experience when you weren't fighting and were just traveling around the map. All of this attention to detail in the level design and atmosphere really paved the way for the story to shine. And I have to say, they knocked it out of the park with this. The characters were great, the voice acting was absolutely fantastic, especially in the original Japanese, but the English voice acting is really good as well. I can't speak on the other languages, but I'm sure those French and Spanish voice actors were pretty good as well. Maybe I have to go through another replay and try it out. Anyways, that sums up all of the positives. As for negatives, there really weren't too many. I think the only things that I found to be issues were the camera lock / grapple lock. I found that would always kind of screw me over in the most inopportune moments, whether it be trying to traverse across a cliff and falling to my death, or in the final crucial moments of that boss battle. Man, that camera would start acting wonky, and dead. That's how it is sometimes, though. Other than that, I'd say my final nitpick was that some sections of the game, especially when you're like approaching a mini boss or something, you'd require too much stealth to take out all of the minions before you could fight the boss one-on-one, because otherwise you're just gonna get harassed by these little guys and it's no fun. And I found that a bit repetitive, having to go back through and, you know, sneak around and kill all those guys before confronting the mini boss again. But that could probably be solved by just getting good. So I think my final nitpick is just the screen monkey boss. Compared to all the other bosses, which were super fun, I think the screen monkeys were a bit of a miss, a bit gimmicky. But other than that, all the bosses were fantastic, and the final boss is hands down my favorite From Software boss, period. And finally, the moment we've all been waiting for. With all that being said, all those positives and just a few negatives, I'm going to give Sekiro Shadows Die Twice a Sapien score of 9.5 bananas. Certified ripe. Anyways, that's pretty much it. Thanks for tuning on in, and I'll catch you next time. Adios, amigos.